The ban on serrated knives, large knives, so-called zombie knives, is coming into full force in September, allegedly, but it's election time. So the Labour Party and Idris Elba are campaigning for the full ban on swords. That's right, the Idris Elba who has used lots of swords in loads of movies. And but anyway, let's leave Idris Elba aside. That's a curious one. I understand the motivations for trying to tackle knife crime. It's a massive problem in the UK. I don't think this is the right approach. That's right, the Labour Party is now calling for a ban on swords. Now, I know many of you out there said that when they originally started talking about zombie knife bans and machete bans, swords will be next. What's next? Cutlery, kitchen knives, who knows? We'll get to that in a minute. But the Labour Party are now in the run-up to the election calling for a bigger ban, a wider ban on swords. That's right, swords as in the sorts of things used by historical reenactors at national heritage events, or the things used by fencers in fencing clubs in universities and schools, the length and breadth of the country, or indeed the type of swords used by or known by ex-military officers. That's right, they're calling for a full sweeping blanket ban on swords. Very briefly, for anyone who doesn't know who I am, if you've been shared this video, I am Matt Easton. I'm a fencing instructor. I also work as a consultant to various museums, like the Royal Armouries, for example. I'm also an antique dealer, antique sword dealer. Can't avoid that point. I do have a vested interest in this subject, but that's also why I know about this subject. And because of my professional background, I'm also involved in consulting for police and lawyers on the matter of seized and illegal weapons, sometimes identifying whether they are legal or illegal. So that is a service I offer. And I should also throw in that I am a former civil servant of 17 years service in Whitehall, and I did at one point a long time ago work for the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority, working closely with police and lawyers. So I very much understand the impacts of knife crime. I'm a Londoner myself, I've seen it myself, so I fully understand and fully sympathise. So why is there a sudden call by the Labour Party for a ban on swords, and backed up by Idris Elba supporting them? Is there any evidence for an increase in the use of swords in crime? No, we'll get to that in a minute. Clearly this is an election year, so that's what they're going for. They've decided to go for something bigger and better than the Tories and the Conservative Party are doing. Now, if your main concern is knife crime and you don't know anything about swords, let me just explain to you that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people in the UK on a daily basis using and being around swords. Things like fencing, martial arts practice, military personnel, obviously, for parade purposes, but also ex-military. Every ex-military officer who I personally know has a sword still. But also think about things like historical reenactment of battles, or film and TV, for example. So every theatre production, loads of film and TV stuff use swords. It's completely normal. There's loads of them around, and there's a whole infrastructure of businesses and people training people how to use those things for stage or performance or other purposes, and providing those things to those people. In case you hadn't noticed, Britain's rather famous for its film industry and infrastructure. Lots of people come from all around the world to make movies here. There is a massive infrastructure and economy behind providing both the swords, for example, that you see on screen or on stage, and the people who are trained to use them, actors. Every theatre school, the length and breadth of the country, uses swords for training. And not to mention the sporting side of things as well. Fencing. Fencing is a huge hobby done by pretty much every university that I'm aware of, and a lot of schools as well have fencing clubs. If you go to the Tower of London or Hampton Court, you will very often see historical reenactors and performers and people educating and presenting to the public, something that I've done myself. I've even presented in schools with swords many times, because kids love to learn about knights and battles and fencing and that kind of stuff. It's completely normal. If you go to these historical palaces and castles, you'll see those performers, you will see swords. There are tons of them around. If you go to the Lord Mayor's show, right slap bang in the middle of London, not only will you see military personnel, but you'll also see historical reenactors wearing swords in the middle of London. They are everywhere. So why are the Labour Party and Idris Elba calling for a ban on swords? Has there been a rise in their use in crime? Have they ever really much been used in crime? The answer is no. I've done a hell of a lot of research on this, looking on the Office for National Statistics website and various other places, various individual police websites as well. there are no official statistics on swords being used in crime, because it is so rare that when it does happen, and it does happen occasionally, when it does happen, it's front headline news because the attacker used a samurai sword or some other type of large weapon. It's unusual. The fact is, individual weapons are not recorded in official statistics by the police or ONS or anyone else, but as far as we can tell, they are tiny, like less than 1% of all of the knife crime that's done, all of the stabbings that are done. What are used in stabbings? Kitchen knives. You know that, I know that, the police know that, the Home Office, who I've had meetings with, know that. Everybody knows that. Kitchen knives are the predominant knife used in knife crime. And don't only think of street knife crime. Yes, indeed, machetes have become popular to carry around by gangs in recent years. But actually, a large percentage of knife crime is actually domestic in the house, and therefore the obvious weapon that's used is a knife. It is a kitchen knife from the kitchen. But equally, kitchen knives are very prevalent on the street as well, because they're easy to conceal, easy to buy, easy to get rid of. And according to Kent Police, in one info sheet that they produced, it was over 70% of knives used in crime were kitchen knives. According to a report on the ONS website at one point, which now seems to have gone away, it was over 80%. So we're talking about very large percentages of knives used in knife crime are kitchen knives. They are not swords, they are not machetes, they are not dangerous knives, whatever that might mean, because every knife is dangerous. They are kitchen knives. And another significant percentage of objects used in knife crime aren't even knives, they are screwdrivers, chisels, scissors even, and things like that. The fact is that statistically, swords are used by hundreds of thousands of people in the country, and collected as well, just hung on the wall. So hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the country have access to swords, but the number of swords used in crime is incredibly small. Now, Labour MP Helen Hayes argues that if gangs couldn't get access to machetes, then obviously they might use swords, so we should make swords illegal. Sorry to break it to you, Helen Hayes, but gangs are already using kitchen knives and every other type of implement they can get their hands on. If they can't get their hands on a machete, it's far easier to get their hands on a meat cleaver, a kebab knife, a hatchet from a hardware store. There are all sorts of options. They don't have to go online and buy a sword. Now, understandably, in many of the areas where knife crime is very high, there is a legitimate call to get machetes off our streets. But here's a home truth for you. If you ban machetes, that is not going to make the machetes disappear in any way, shape or form. Even if a gang member couldn't buy a machete, they would get another form of large knife. A kebab knife, a large carving knife, a large kitchen knife, or a hatchet or a meat cleaver. These are all things that are used for trades, are necessary, and are easy to obtain. So banning machetes won't make machetes go away. And moreover, it's very important to point out that the law already exists. It is already illegal to take a kitchen knife, a machete, a sword, or anything into the street without some legitimate legal purpose, like you've just purchased it from a shop and you're taking it home. If you're walking around the street with any form of sharp object or even blunt object hidden inside your clothes, there is always a law in place such that you can be convicted for that. That law already exists. It just needs to be enforced. Now, in my previous video on this subject, in defense of the common garden machete, I understand that if you're a Londoner who's always lived in the city, you might have an idea that a machete is a weapon that is featured in The Walking Dead and zombie movies in general, or computer games, and that is something that is very scary and it's only to harm people. It's not. A machete is a garden tool. I live in the countryside. I own a machete, not because I particularly want a machete for collecting, but because I have a large garden. I live on the edge of a National Trust forest. Now, when I made my previous video, I was contacted by literally hundreds of people who use machetes on an almost daily basis for either their hobbies or their actual job, their work. Now, I've made a list of people that contacted me here. These include people who were gardeners, people who have allotments, foresters, people who manage the forest, farmers, and interestingly, I didn't think about this one, people who work in conservation, nature reserves essentially, they use hand tools because they can't use things like chainsaws and electric hedge cutters because of nesting birds and things like this, so they use hand tools. There's also traditional crafts people, bushcraft, all this kind of stuff as well, hobby stuff. So there are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people in the country legally and peacefully using machetes pretty much every day as part of their job or trade or hobby. But I hear some people cry, particularly from inner city areas, but machetes are so scary, the wounds they deal out are horrible, they must be taken off the streets. I agree they should be taken off the streets. But in terms of what the machete does, it is functionally no different to, for example, kebab knives, butcher's cleavers, meat cleavers, hedging bills, commonly used actually in forestry, large fishing knives and fillet knives, and things like sickles and scythes as well. So there are a whole range of garden and kind of fishing and outdoorsy kind of pursuits tools that are functionally no different to a machete at all. Once again, I repeat, if you live in a fantasy world where you think it's possible to make machetes cease to exist in the United Kingdom, what do criminals do? Do they think, oh, well, I'm not going to hurt anybody today? No. The intention is to hurt somebody. The tool is incidental. If they decide to use a machete because there is a machete there, that's what they'll use. But if there isn't a machete there, they will use a kitchen knife, a carving knife, a meat cleaver, a hatchet, whatever. Okay? So the problem is the criminal, the problem is not the implement they choose to use. So as I start to wind up this video, I'm going to put my civil servant hat on, ex-civil servant hat on, and consider the evidence, consider learning from the past. What has happened in the last 60 years? We have seen continual bans of specific objects. It started back, I think, in the 1960s with flick knives because they'd been featured in a few movies and there was some hysteria around them. Later on, we got things like sword canes, knuckle dusters, various other things came in. Fine, you might agree that they're banned, whatever. Later on, we come through various ninja weapons. In 1988, the Conservatives banned a whole load of ninja weapons because of Teenage Mutant Hero Ninja Turtles, as they were called internationally. And so they banned a load of ninja weapons, which I think there's no evidence were being used in crimes. And then in 2008, there was the samurai sword ban because of a handful of assaults that have been carried out with samurai swords. And that has caused a huge amount of problem for fencers, martial artists, re-enactors, collectors since, but nevertheless. So what can we learn from that period of legislation? We have had 60 years of bannings of specific types of knife and sword. What's happened during that time? Knife crime has gone up and up and up. And according to the latest statistics since 2015, according to Yvette Cooper, the Labour Shadow Home Secretary, knife crime has gone up by 77% since 2015, in 8 years. So surely there's a lesson to be learned there. If we keep banning things and knife crime keeps going up, could it be that banning flick knives and knuckle dusters and sword canes and samurai swords maybe hasn't achieved anything, maybe hasn't reduced knife crime? Maybe it's because most knife crime is being done with kitchen knives. Maybe it's because criminals who want to stab someone just use whatever they can get, and banning something like a machete will make no difference at all. Yes, that would be my logical conclusion. Bans of specific type of knife or sword do not work. They do not reduce knife crime. They never will. If you don't believe me, watch what happens in the next 10 or 20 years. Watch the statistics. The only things which will reduce knife crime are social strategies. They are not banning a machete. Banning machete will never achieve anything at all. So that being the case, why should hundreds of thousands of people, whether they be fencers, martial artists, historical reenactors, theatre, film, television performers and stage choreographers, people working in museums, why should these people be penalised and punished for the activity, the criminal activities of a relatively small number of people in inner city areas, particularly London? Why should the rest of us be punished? Why should people who want to maintain forests in nature reserves in Herefordshire be punished for the criminal activities of gangs in the centre of London? This is wrong. So this is a plea from a British person who's currently still living in Britain but having to look at emigration for the sake of my own research, hobbies and businesses. Think about all of the people living in the UK who are adversely affected by this lawmaking, and what beneficial effect, apart from politics and winning a feather for your cap from the leader of your party, what benefits on the street this will have. I also plead directly to Idris Elba. I promise you, banning machetes will not reduce knife crime. There is always another object they can use. Every kitchen is full of kitchen knives, and kitchen knives are actually more dangerous medically than machetes are. It will not help. There are many things that will help, and there are things which both the Labour Party, Idris Elba, and various other people on the Conservatives as well have suggested, social strategies which will help, economic and social things which can help, and dealing with the gang problem. Banning tools like a machete that's used by gardeners and foresters, or banning swords that's used by people like fencers and theatre actors, and you know, Idris, you yourself have used swords in movies. Think about this for a second. How are you going to practice your choreography? How are you going to perform as Heimdall or anyone else on screen if you can't get access to a sword? People like me train people like you to do that. Okay? Why penalise hundreds of thousands of people doing hobbies and jobs and things that would benefit the whole country because of a small number of criminals and their victims in inner city areas? There are better ways to help them than penalising everybody else. Criminals don't obey the law. I have been Matt Easton. I hope this has been thought-provoking. If it has been, please share it around. What can you do? I suggest you write to your MP. It doesn't matter whether they're Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, whatever. Write to them and try and explain to them that swords, at the very least, are used by hundreds of thousands of people. They're used by children in schools, for crying out loud. They're used by actors in Hollywood movies. They're used by historical reenactors at the Tower of London. We have to protect our heritage and our culture and our right to be able to pursue these beneficial heritage pursuits and sports that are so good for our country and so good for hundreds of thousands of people, and provide jobs and entertainment to huge millions of people around the world, the millions of tourists that come and visit us every year, who go to a castle and want to see a battle reenactment, or go to Hampton Court and want to see some Elizabethan duelling. This has to be protected. Big picture. In trying to deal with one problem, don't destroy a whole load of other things. This is a plea. I hope it's taken in the way that it's meant. Get posting in the comments down below. Give me your thoughts, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.